Hello. In late 1978, Superman the movie came to theaters in the United States. I was a little more than 5 years old, and my parents took me to see the film with them. Probably because I was 5 years old and I was excited about the idea of Superman, and possibly because they were too cheap to hire a babysitter. We got to the theater about 30 minutes late, so caught the last 2 hours of the movie, and then stayed in the theater during the changeover, and stayed again for the entire next showing, because my parents were too cheap to nip back out and purchase tickets to the next showing, and you could do that back in the 1970s. Superman the movie changed the way that I saw the world. Before that, all my TV experience were either cartoons or PBS. After that, my TV experiences would be science fiction and PBS. Specifically, science fiction shows that aired on PBS. The visual language of Superman the movie set my 5-year-old brain alight. The opening curtains, pulling back to reveal a comic book, a child reading the comic book, the visual dissolve from a comic book panel to a live visual, and then a pan up through space, and then a flight through space, set to John Williams' urgent, questing score. Wow. I became a Doctor Who fan about 6 years after that. As I mentioned before, I started with bits of seasons 20 and 21 on PBS. My station then cycled back around to Robot, and the entire Tom Baker run took about the next 7 months of 1985. Now, the visual language of the first 6 years of Tom Baker, safe and predictable. Those trippy, if not groovy, opening credits, already dated to the 1985 11-year-old's eye. Dudley Simpson's dependable, if sometimes monotonous, brassy scores. And then, on a Friday night, at the end of summer 1985, 7 p.m., I tuned in for part 1 of the Leisure Hive, expecting those 1974 opening visuals and Dudley Simpson. Unaware at that point that season 18 was the switchover moment, the unmistakable arrival of one John Nathan Turner.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who Podcast Network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. This is the second episode in 2 days. This is my regular Sunday episode in publication order. This is episode number 69, Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive. Yesterday was my third annual April 1st episode, my second one on this podcast. Stacey Smith and I had a fun time talking about the 8 Doctors, the Terrance Dicks novel, not a novelization but a full-length novel from 1997, the first novel in the BBC Books 8th Doctor Adventures series. Not the most beloved book throughout fandom, but Stacey and I revisited the book and found a lot to admire, and of course the debate at some points got a little charged, which happens, and we are now back on track once again in publication order, talking about the Target Books. We are in the middle of 1982. This is one of 4 different podcast episodes featuring Jason to drop this weekend. Yesterday's Doctor Who Literature, today's Doctor Who Literature. Today also saw my latest Trap 1 episode. I hosted a panel about the Season 2 Blu-ray box set, along with Si Hart, whose voice you're going to hear back here in a few minutes, Denise Sutton, whose lovely voice you heard here a few weeks ago, and Keith Say, whose voice you will hear in the coming weeks and months on this podcast. I also appeared on an episode of We're All Stories in the End. That's Ian Martin's excellent podcast, talking about the New Adventures and 8th Doctor Adventures, which ran from 1991 to 2005 inclusive. Ian was on this show discussing the power of Kroll back in episode 57. That released during the holidays in late 2022. So that's 4 different Jason episodes that you can hear. All came out this weekend. This weekend, I am also recording 2 other episodes of 2 other podcasts coming up soon. You can hear me once again on the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, without which my show might not exist in the first place. And I also have recorded an episode of Gallifrey's Most Wanted with Ross, who you've heard on the show several times before and will hear on the show several times again. We were talking about a classic Doctor Who serial, and that episode will also be coming out in a couple of weeks. So there's an awful lot of Jason going about the podcast sphere when it comes to Doctor Who. And yes, you can put extra emphasis on the word awful if you so choose. I will have links to the 2 other Jason episodes that dropped today in the show notes, and as the other episodes come out, I will put those in the show notes for upcoming episodes. But enough about me. Let's talk about you. Coming up soon, my episode on the 5 Doctors. Similar to my episode on the War Games back in episode 50, I am looking for your contribution. I would love from you a 3 to 5 minute audio essay on the 5 Doctors, perhaps with the theme, is the 5 Doctors the greatest classic Doctor Who story of all time? Or on any other 5 Doctors related topic of your choice. But pick your topic wisely. Be sure. Be very sure. To coin a phrase. I've already gotten some of your contributions. I'm very, very excited to hear what all of y'all are going to come up with. This week, Si Hart. Si is one of my most energetic guests. We are going to have a fabulous conversation. I love any episode related to season 18. It's one of my favorite eras of the show. If you hadn't noticed from listening carefully to the last 3 or 4 weeks worth of episodes, we are going to get into it about the Leisure Hive on television. We are going to get into it about Leisure Hive the book. Then we are going to get into it with the game of 20 questions. Let's get to it.
Hi, I'm Rupert Booth.
I am known as Paul Ferry.
And my name is Barry Williams.
Together, we host Time Ram.
Time Ram's a cruel mistress.
It's a random number generator.
That also.
We roll a number from 1 to 30, and that's our doctor. Then 1 to 300 for the story, and then we ram them together.
Even if it doesn't make sense.
Cruel, I tell you.
Time Ram, putting the wrong doctors in the wrong stories, so you don't have to.
You're listening to Doctor Who Literature.
All right, Si, as I was getting ready to send you the invitation to this recording session, I noticed that you were already on Twitter hyping up your appearance today, and you have a great photo of you getting ready to discuss this week's episode, and you were holding up multiple copies of the book. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about the transatlantic culture gap. What is the title of this book/TV episode?
This is Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive.
Whereas in the States, it would be considered Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive.
Yeah, which just sounds wrong. To me, anyway.
I was going to say it the other way around. Leisure Hive sounds... I just can't... It's the same reason that I use American pronunciations on my show. Saying Dalek would seem fake to me, so I just pronounce it Dalek the way you would if it was an American word.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I first saw this episode in 1985, and I know they pronounced it Leisure Hive on screen. In my head, it is only ever the Leisure Hive, and it's been that way for 38 years.
Well, these things happen, so as long as you like the story, it doesn't matter.
I love the story, but therein hangs a tale. Let's talk about your collection of books first, because this tweet that you put up, and we were recording on the Thursday afternoon, features you holding up multiple copies of the book. But when you started recording, I learned that you actually have more than 2 copies. So help me out.
I have a third copy, on which I'm holding up now, but although that doesn't help your listeners. So I have a very battered old public library hardback copy as well that I bought on eBay a few years ago. But I am immensely treasure my original paperback, which is the original edition from 1982, because my dad very very wonderfully queued up in his lunch hour one day to meet Peter Davison to get his signature. Now, I know this is the wrong Doctor and for years I very carefully didn't say anything to my dad that I was very upset that it was a Tom Baker story and Peter Davison wasn't in it. But then years later, I realised that actually there was only one Peter Davison book out in 1982, which was The Visitation, which he'd bought me earlier in the year. So he wasn't going to buy me that one again. So he probably wouldn't have known that Peter Davison wasn't even in this story. So it's absolutely fine.
This was the era of the books when John Nathan Turner, as producer, was not allowing past Doctors to appear on the book cover, which is why Tom Baker, with one exception, does not appear on the cover of any book published after State of Decay, which came out in the month of Castrovalva. But the crazy part is this. You are not even the first guest on my show to have a Tom Baker novelization autographed by Peter Davison.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. That's really weird.
Stacey Smith told the story way back in the beginning of this podcast. She had a copy of Doctor Who and the Giant Robot, which she bought at a bookstore when her dad brought her to see Peter Davison doing a signing in Australia. So this would have been probably after you, but that means that when Stacey had the book signed by Peter, it was not even the first time Peter had signed a book for the wrong Doctor. Which begs the question, what is going through his head as he is signing somebody else's book?
Well, exactly. I have a copy of the Green Death, which is signed by Tom Baker. So this is obviously something that happened, that people just bought a Target book and got it signed by a Doctor if they were attending a signing or something at this point. So it must be a peculiar thing that people have somewhere in their collections, books. I've got actually a copy of The Dalek Invasion of Earth, thinking about it, signed by Tom Baker as well. So, it's that I've picked up secondhand down the years. So there must be just something. It's a Target book. It doesn't matter.
There is that gag on The Simpsons. Comic book guy tries to sell Bart a photograph of Sean Connery signed by Roger Moore.
Yeah, I'd have bought that. I think that's really funny. I like that.
And I'm sure Roger Moore would have been happy to sign it too, but probably not the other way around.
No.
So next question is, I can understand how you have two copies of the book. You have the first edition paperback. For reference, I have the third edition, which was published in 1984. This book was so popular that it went through two printings in 1982, and then a third printing a couple of years later. I started collecting my books in 85, which is when I basically became a fan, so it stands to reason that I would have a later edition. And I can understand the value of having a hardcover. They're sturdier. How do you also come to have the third book in your collection, which you posted on Twitter a little bit, and that was The Blue Spine from the 1990s?
Well, this is a fairly newish development over the last few years that I decided that it would be worth collecting everything all over again, because I hadn't done any Target book collecting for a little while. And I'd never bought the Blue Spines at the time, thinking, well, I've got a complete set. I don't need to do this. And then I just thought, do you know what? It'd be really nice just to have a set of every Target book with every different cover. And I'm not fussed about logos being different colours or things like that on different printings, but I'd just like to have all the individual covers. So I did buy. I've been very slowly collecting the Leisure Hive, all the Blue Spine Target books over the last few years, because I set myself a challenge of actually buying them in shops and at conventions and things like that, rather than just going on eBay and buying the whole lot straight away. I wanted to actually go out of my way and find them like I used to do with my original Target set. So I'm nowhere near completing the set. But I think the Leisure Hive has one of the best reprint covers ever. I met Alistair Pearson a few weeks last year at the Terrance Dicks event, and the Andrew Skilleter cover is also really brilliant. The Leisure Hive has always done really well out of covers.
I just want to narrate for the audience. I'm sure not everybody has. Hold up that Blue Spine again.
Okay.
What's remarkable is the similarities, because they both have a yellowish color scheme. They have almost identical illustrations of the Hive and of the Fomassi. It's not quite the same Fomassi, but it's in a similar pose. The only difference is I have David Haig on the cover of mine
Yeah, and
because
I
this
have
is the no doctor on the cover era. You have
and I have very old Tom.
very old Tom, yes, as he appeared in the second half of the
Yes.
story.
And I spoke to Alistair Pearson about this because I said, because I've got my time frame signed, which is the book that I've been getting everyone to sign through the years. And when I finally met Alistair, I said, I'd like you to sign. Can you sign the Leisure Hive page? Because I really love that cover and I love the story. And he said, yes, of course. He said, that's my favourite cover of all the ones I ever painted. That's the one that I love the most. So,
Oh, wow, that's great.
He's a huge fan of the Leisure Hive as well. So he's a quality man.
So before we talk about the story, lots of other things to discuss. Number one, I have my 2-month podcast backlog, and through
Yes.
judicious pruning and having extra time on the subway now that I'm going back to work in the office once in a while, I've been able to clear my backlog down to 7 weeks. The problem is
That's not bad.
that still doesn't leave enough time. Doctor Who is not my only fandom or area of interest, so my Who podcasts are only a small portion of what I listen to. I have to miss out on a lot of stuff because there is just not enough time. If I had my way, there would be maybe 15 Doctor Who podcasts that I would hear on the regular. That would extend my backlog to a year, which obviously defeats the purpose. But this is a long way of saying that you, my friend, have been on so many podcasts recently that I cannot even keep track. You are probably, and I don't know if this is being kept track of, but at least in my circle, you are probably on more podcasts, more episodes of podcasts, and more individual podcasts than anyone else who is not a professional employee of Doctor Who, i.e. an actor or a creative contributor. You're probably more podcast appearances than any other fan. So give us a brief rundown of where else I have not been able to hear you over the last 2 months.
People are wonderful and they keep asking me to come and do podcasts with them. So I never turn anything down because it's so much fun. So just recently, we did a Trap 1 at the weekend. Looking at the Series 2 Blu-ray, Season 2 Blu-ray, which was great fun. I have, of course, been continually doing a hamster with a blunt penknife because I love recording with Joe, and I love recording with Joe and Fraser very, very much. I've obviously done Maximum Power, the Blake 7 podcast, which I am a member of the team of. I have... very kindly, I was invited by the lovely Dave Rennie to come and do a couple of episodes of his new podcast, A Kettle and Some String.
Now, him I don't know. So what show is that? I don't think I've met him.
So this is it's a fairly new show, and it's just sort of talking about Doctor Who stories in random order. And it's a sort of more a discussion than a commentary podcast. So I've recently done Enlightenment and The King's Demons. So that's been a joy. And I've been also randomly, I have recorded a podcast about Battle of the Planets that is coming out on Steve Alexander's podcast, Robots in Your Eyes.
I only
which is about
just
Saturday
heard about
morning
that.
Cartoons.
I only just heard about that last week, so I haven't had a chance to hear it yet. The funny thing is, looking at his list of episodes, he's probably about 5 years younger than me, which is 5 years is everything in cartoons because
Absolutely
he probably started watching when I stopped. So I've heard of the shows he discusses, but I never watched them because they were all after my time.
No, a few of them are later than mine, so as well. So this happens, and. Is that it? I think that's everything recently. Oh, and I did a Gallifrey's Most Wanted recently as well, back in January. So,
yeah, I have a little bit of a part to play in that because I believe you were supposed to discuss Patrick Troughton, and I was recording with Ross the day before, and he trailed your upcoming appearance, and I mentioned that he had already done a Patrick episode with Fraser like a month before that I had heard recently because of my 2-month backlog.
yes.
So you guys on the fly adjusted and did a televised classic series season 4 review.
That's right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which I just heard about a week and a half ago, thanks to my backlog getting whittled down to size.
But yes, but it is also an absolute joy to be back on here. So it's been a little while. So I'm very pleased to be back.
Yeah, you were for a while my all-time record holder for number of appearances. I'm not sure if you still have the record because I don't have I haven't been keeping a running tab of who's on
Mm-hmm.
how many times. I have the list of who's been in every episode. So let's take a look. You were on episode 8, The Demons. That was where you joined me on short notice when somebody else
That's right. Yeah.
ghosted me a week before the recording. You did Loch Ness Monster, which is episode 18. You were back a month later for Genesis of the Daleks, or Daleks,
Daleks.
episode 23. Then you were back for Planet of Evil, episode 34. Invisible Enemy, episode 47.
Yeah, and then this one.
So this is going to be your 6th appearance. And then after this, I have you recommended for a couple of others, but we'll discuss that after we stop
Mhm.
recording. Now, you had mentioned Enlightenment and the King's Demons. Now, those, of course, are stories that I have cavilled about on somebody else's podcast a couple of years ago. I think Enlightenment is
did.
one of the... with Enlightenment, I was met with enthusiasm and agreement. How was I received on that other show talking about the King's Demons?
Oh, with derision. I think it's the word.
But I'm glad you brought up those two stories because it segues into my next question. Thinking about surveys, so you have the Mighty 200 poll in DWM in the year 2009. Then you had the survey of everything except Day of the Doctor, which came out early 2014, compiled in 2013. That had 241 stories between Unearthly Child and Name of the Doctor. They are now getting ready to put out a new survey, but as I understand it, is not going to be a top to bottom list. It's only rankings of individual doctors.
That's how it looks in today's DWM, yes.
So you have been, I am not a DWM subscriber, but you have been posting links to the poll. So I have been entering the poll, starting with 3 and 4, because I missed the one for 1 and 2. So just today, I submitted my rankings for the 5th and 6th Doctors. Although they only have Trial of a Time Lord as one story when everyone knows that it's 4. So that was a bit unusual. I had to give a very rough composite score.
Mm-hmm.
I ranked, and let me just call these up on my phone so I can go over my scores with you. And I do not mind sharing my vote in public, and I imagine that you'll do the same once I've told you mine. So I am very high on the Davison era. Again, I've talked about it on other shows. We are just starting the Davison era on this show next week because the next book after this is The Visitation, book 70.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start talking about Peter Davison. So I did screenshots of my votes for seasons 20 and 21. So from Arc of Infinity to the 5 Doctors, I have the following scores: 7, 9, 9, 4, 10, 9, 10. 10 being the 5 Doctors. You can guess which one is my 4. That's Terminus. How did you rank the same season?
I think it was Arc of Infinity got a 4. Snake Dance got 9. Mordred Undead got 9. Terminus got 6. Enlightenment got a 9. King's Demons got a 7. And the 5 Doctors got a 10.
So 3 of our scores are tied. We did the same for Snake Dance, Mordred, and 5. I gave Enlightenment a 10 rather than a 9. I have Arc of Infinity higher than you because it was my first proper story / cliffhanger.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you have to add at least 2 points for sentiment.
You certainly do.
Terminus, I think 6 is fair. I gave it a 4 because I was having this conversation with another friend on Twitter today. If you take out Roger Lim's score and you replace it with a new Paddy Kingsland synth rock score, it automatically goes up 2 points.
Absolutely.
And if you swap out Mary Ridge and put in Peter Grimwade or Graham Harper as a director, it might go up from a 6 to an 8.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my season 20. Let's talk about season 21. And then we're going to backtrack and talk about season 18, which is the topic of today's show. So I very famously defended Warriors of the Deep to a death on another podcast 2 years ago. I gave it an 8, partly out of spite. Probably is a 7 or 6 more realistically, but I am the official defender of Warriors. I had to give it an 8. Every other score is a 9, except for Caves, which I gave a 10.
Okay.
And Twin Dilemma is in a different poll for Colin Baker. So season 21, I just absolutely adore. 8, 9, 9, 9, 9, 10. How about yourself?
I'm a little more varied than you. So it's a 6 for Warriors of the Deep, an 8 for The Awakening, a 10 for Frontios, which is my favourite Davison story, a 6 for Resurrection of the Daleks because it's a very exciting mess of a story. Planet of Fire I gave an 8 to because I really like that, and Caves I gave a 9 to because I don't think it is perfect, but I do really like it.
And these are all stories that are coming up within the next few months on
Mm-hmm.
Doctor Who literature, with the exception of Resurrection, which is one of the 21st century targets. That episode might not be out for about 2 years. I did a very polite discussion of that book on Trap One when the hardcover came out about 5 years ago, but I was holding back on my actual opinion, so I look forward to revealing that.
That will
in the
be a
fullness of
joy
time.
because that's certainly a book.
Again, I think 6 is a very fair score for Warriors, and I
Mhm.
think we have a couple of points off on all the others. Resurrection was my first proper Dalek story,
Okay.
and I understand intellectually that there are problems with the tone and the pacing. I love it. I love
Well,
Resurrection.
sometimes you just love something, and that's absolutely fine. Which brings
So,
me to The Leisure Hive, which is a story that I just absolutely love.
and here's where I want to lead in this part of the conversation.
Okay.
It was either last week or the week before, I was discussing with my guest where you rank season 18, and we're talking about the 2014 DWM survey. I am a huge season 18 fan because Logopolis was the first novelization that I read, not the first one that I owned. And season 18 through 21 for me is Doctor Who's second golden age. Well, maybe third, maybe fourth. It's got a lot of golden ages in the classic series, but season 18 through 21 for me is where it's at. These are it's where I came in, because I came in end of season 19, beginning of season 20. When I went to the 2014 DWM survey, and this was discussed last week, episode 68 with Leland Stolt from the Indoctrination podcast, I was expecting season 18 to rank a lot higher than it did. Only 2 stories in the top 100, which for my money is criminal. And then Leisure Hive ranks in the 170s out of 241. I just cannot figure that out in any way, shape, or form. Help me out here.
Well, I don't understand it either. Season 18 is my favourite season of Doctor Who of all. It's never ever been surpassed for me, which, considering it was my second season in, this is a bit of a problem, really. I absolutely adore all of these stories, and I adore the Leisure Hive more than many other stories, and I don't understand its reputation whatsoever. I don't see what everyone else is obviously missing in this, because there is so much in this story and so many things. This was the story that made me a fan. This was the one that tipped me over the edge from really liking the show to absolutely loving it to pieces. And I just don't know. I don't understand why it is not higher rated. It deserves to be loved.
I'm trying to identify the story for me that put me over the edge. I didn't see Leisure Hive on television until I'd been a fan for about 10 months, so that was a little too late for that. I think for me, the story that made me interested was Arc of Infinity, the Part 2 cliffhanger, because at that point I was 11, I was mostly watching children's television. So a serious cliffhanger like that, where the main character is seemingly disintegrated on camera, that caught my attention. Mawdryn Undead, episode 3 cliffhanger, definitely grabbed my attention. But it was Enlightenment, because I missed Terminus. I wasn't watching that week for whatever reason. When I saw Enlightenment Part 1, this would have been December probably of 2020. December of 1984. There was no turning back. The Enlightenment Part 1 cliffhanger, I think, is the moment after which I never voluntarily missed another episode.
No, it was seeing a trailer for this that was broadcast the day that it was going to be on, and it was just full of really strange images. And I've talked about this quite a lot on various different places, but this story had so many images that weren't like anything else on TV, and that grabbed my 5-year-old imagination, and that was it. It was all about Doctor Who after that. And seeing Pangol's head floating off his body and then sort of spinning round in the great big bubble screen, and Tom Baker's face as he's being, and his body being ripped apart, which, looking at it now, the effect doesn't quite hold up. The perspective is all wrong, but it doesn't matter. I don't care. I am transported back to being 5 years old and seeing that, and it being the most terrifying and thrilling moment in Doctor Who that I had seen up to this point. And there are so many things like that in this story. K9 blowing up in the sea and making me very upset as a young 5-year-old, because I love K9. K9 was the first thing that I loved in Doctor Who, so that was upsetting. But it's just full of magical images and brilliant things. The Doctor aging and not turning back to a young man straight away, and the army of Pangol's all marching on the screen and expanding with the Quantel effects. And as I got older, there's more stuff. There's the really beautifully understated love story from Mina and Hardin that is sort of coming and going, and the affection sort of between them, and then the distance, and then the affection coming back as Mina begins to age, and the mystery of Pangol, and a brilliant, superb early performance from David Haig at the start of his career. It's just brilliant.
I know you have not heard the cold open to this show yet. Number one, because I haven't recorded it, and number two, because you're not going to hear it until Sunday. Almost word for word, the point that I was making about how the visual look of this show when I saw it changed everything for me, because before that I had watched, it took them 7 months on my PBS station to go from Robot Part 1 to Horns of Nimon Part 4, airing the show Monday to Friday, 7 to 7:30. So Robot Part 1 aired the first Monday in February 1985, and Leisure Hive, I think, aired the Friday before Labor Day, right before I would have gone back to school, entering the 7th grade and starting junior high school. It took about 7 months, and for those 7 months, all I was watching for the most part is Tom Baker, 25 minutes a night, and it had the Bernard Lodge opening title sequence, and you have the Dudley Simpson music. There were a couple of non-Dudley composers early in the Hinchcliffe era. You had Carrie Blyton, you had Jeffrey Burgon, but it was all Dudley all the time, from Mask of Mandragora all the way up through Horns. How awesome is Peter Howell's score for this story, and can you perform for us parts of it? Because I know that, having been experiencing the story this week, I have parts of that score pounding in my head relentlessly.
It's a fabulous score, and it's Peter Howell not knowing when to stop, and that's brilliant. He's just going for it. He's been waiting for this. It's almost like he's been waiting for this opportunity to produce something that is so dramatic. But there's so many brilliant parts of it. There's the march for Pangol, there's the opening, the very wistful theme on Brighton Beach, sort of leading into the Doctor Who theme, Snatch, as you spot the police box, and I do like to be beside the seaside. There's the wonderful Inter Argolis piece where you're going through the starfield to the Argolin dawn and the sun coming up across the height. There's just so many great bits, and then even the last bit where you've got the underbeat of the Doctor Who theme, where they're doing all the sort of, well, I'm going to be very glad to get back to work, and bits like that. That's just lovely, sort of leading into the end theme and the last shot of the hive before it finishes. I love the score to pieces.
I also want to point out, and I'll talk about Lavette Bickford a little more on the other side of the break. This is the first time that we see the TARDIS materialize as the camera is in motion.
Yes.
Because prior to this, they could only do rollback and mix. And then he comes in, Bickford, and does a new technique, which had never been done before in the previous 17 seasons.
Yeah, and it's just little things like that. They're just pushing the envelope just that little bit more. And it's multi-camera studio, but done as single camera shots. And so it still feels modern, even though it's all almost all videotape production, sort of once you're past the Brighton Beach scenes at the start. But it feels modern, and the way the cameras are moving and the direction is just on the go all the time, and things like the hologram in the screen and things like that are different to normal techniques. And it's not just a static screen that you're watching. He's trying to push the boundaries of what this show can do.
And it's reminiscent of what Graham Harper is going to do 3 years down the line in Caves of Androzani, which I gave a 10, and you gave an unconscionably low 9 on the latest DWM survey. But Graham Harper has characters walking around the hologram. Lavette Bickford
and
is
he's
almost
lauded
there.
for that, and Lavette Bickford is not lauded for that. It's really odd.
Because Graham Harper came back, Bickford was fired after this,
That's true.
went
Yes.
well over budget.
And well over time.
As a quick parenthetical, have you heard the audio commentary for Leisure Hive on the original DVD? It is Bickford on the left channel, Lalla Ward in the middle, Christopher H. Bidmead on the right channel. They just spend, the two of them, well, with poor Lalla Ward in the middle, spend the whole 90 minutes arguing with each other.
Yes.
Over who did what wrong. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. It's, yes. And it's not that anyone went wrong. This is the thing. I think there are just different ways of looking at it. But I'm very glad Lavette Bickford did what he did.
I think it's absolutely an amazing story in every sense. So I don't own a copy of the Fourth Doctor Handbook by David J. Howe and Stammers and Walker. Stephen James Walker and Mark Stammers, I think, are their full names. I recall looking at that in the bookshop in the 1990s, and I recall some variation of the phrase, a triumph of style over substance.
And this is where it is. This is the thing that is always trotted out about it.
It's not remotely true. It is not remotely true. Now, we'll talk about the book in a little bit because that's nominally the topic of conversation, but let's just... Free association. I'm going to name an element of the story, not the visuals. We talked about the visuals and the music. Elements of the story that I love. You've talked about the romance between Mina and Hardin. The boardroom scenes, I mean, for me, as an office worker, as somebody in the legal profession, I get off on this stuff. The fact that we have the villain has a day job as a tour guide, the fact that we have Brock as the accountant talking about the spiraling cash projections, the fact that this is a warlike race and they are reduced to running a tourist attraction. I love that boardroom stuff. It is like my day job. It's one of the very few Doctor Who stories to take place in the real world where characters have jobs. Terminus, and this is a very fair point on Terminus, Terminus has middle management and timesheets.
Yes.
Any one of us lives Terminus in our daily life, and it's very rare that Doctor Who goes there and brings in a quotidian element, and I think that grounds the show and makes it much more lovable. So that's something I love about. This is a lived-in world. We can all relate to the Leisure Hive as a poorly run place of employment.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's a down on its luck holiday place, and that it's been superseded, but people are still coming because they're quite interested. But actually, when you look at what's going on that holiday, you've got a long lecture about wave equations and tachyonics. And you think, I'm coming on holiday, and this isn't... I want to see them doing silly things with the tachyonics. I don't want to know how they do it. I just want to see that. And I'm just thinking, that's so brilliant that they're so proud of this that they're going to lecture you on it when all you want to do is go and play zero gravity squash or whatever.
I will be playing the line after the break when I do my audio essay on the book, but David Haig does a great delivery of the line. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to be exploring the wave
Yes.
equations. The worst holiday
Hmm.
ever. Next thing I love about this is, and this is partly David Fisher, I'm sure it's in large part Christopher H. Bidmead with the rewrites. Part 3. Most Doctor Who Part 3s are runaround. Capture, escape, capture. Running through corridors, to borrow the
Yeah.
phrase of the Toby Haydock and Rob Shearman books. Part 3 of this story is all exposition. And I'll talk about this in the audio essay too, because it's a little better on TV than in the book. Part 3 on television is intercut scenes. It's the aged Doctor / Romana / Harden making their way from the lab to the recreation hall. And then it's Brock and Pangal, both of whom are the bad guys, neither one of whom is aware the other one is a bad guy, having a debate about the history of Argolis. Every scene between the two settings leads into the next scene, and it explores a new concept, and it builds. In the beginning of part 3, it's just a vacation home. For you, a British holiday camp. For me, it would be the Borscht Belt Catskills hotels, which are now all defunct. You go there, you're put on a vacation schedule, you must enjoy yourself in 72 hours,
Yeah.
and then it's time to go home. By the end, you realize that the Leisure Hive has this tragic, historic purpose, and it was meant to be the salvation of a race, and it ended up spawning a dreadful, horrible, Hitler-esque villain who you don't realize is the villain until the last minutes of part 3. You could not ask for a better structure to a part 3 in almost any other Doctor Who, with the possible exception of Deadly Assassin, and maybe some others that don't leap as readily to mind. But this is a gorgeously scripted story, and if you take away the style, take away the music and the visuals, it's still fascinating as an audio play to hear the stakes escalate from the beginning of part 3 to the end.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's a very sophisticated piece of scripting all the way through. And it gives both the Doctor and Romana interesting things to do. And because the Doctor is incapacitated, I really like the way Romana then gets to come to the fore. And this is very much like The Haunt of Nymon, where it's very lauded that she's playing the Doctor, but actually she's really playing the Doctor here. She still gets to do the big villain confrontation in part 4. She's the one who takes him on and is calling him out against all the odds when I really like that. It's really strongly written for Romana again.
And I know you and I are coming from different personal perspectives on this. Lalla Ward's costume in this story is just adorable.
Oh,
I could
it's
look at
the best.
I could look at a still photo of her and get as much pleasure out of the Leisure Hive just from a still photo of her in her bathing costume on Brighton Beach.
And even though I am coming at this from a different perspective, I absolutely agree. And I had a pin-up of her in the sailor suit costume on my wall when I was a child. So she's absolutely magnificent and is still my absolute favourite companion of all. She is just amazing. And she doesn't get lauded for what she does nearly enough.
Oh, she does on this show, mister.
Good. I've noticed that, which is great.
There could be negative connotations to what I said about admiring the still photo of Lalla Ward. I first saw the story when I was 11. I am coming at this completely innocently in a non-lascivious and a non-salacious way. I just love that costume, and I love Lalla Ward. Setting aside any negative connotations to what I said, please rest assured, this is a family show.
Yes. But no, she looks magnificent in it, I have to say.
Next thing I love about this story, Tom Baker. All right, you have the Philip Hinchcliffe era Tom Baker. He is dark, he is angry, he is volatile. You never know when he's going to be funny versus when he's going to threaten to punch somebody on the nose. I love the Philip Hinchcliffe era Tom Baker. Then you have the Graham Williams era, which is 15% of every episode is Tom Baker fondling the TARDIS console in a comic way when he's not giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to the K9 prop. So you have early 70s Tom Baker. You have mid-70s Tom Baker. Now we come to season 18. Tom Baker hates coming to work. The producer and the script editor are conspiring to get rid of him, which they will do. He's having a bad time sometimes in his relationship with Lalla Ward. It's famous that in certain parts of State of Decay, they cannot even make eye contact with one another. Then he is given a whole spate of new companions at the end of the season, with whom he has varying degrees of chemistry. I think the performances that Tom gives throughout season 18, from Leisure Hive through Legopolis, are some of the best performances that he's giving because he's no longer in his comfort zone. He's no longer the top dog on his show. All of his drinking buddies no longer work on the series. This is an angry Tom Baker, but I think he's giving some of his best performances ever in this story, in Full Circle, in State of Decay, in Legopolis. And in this story where he's aged 500 years and he's playing old man bordering on senility, which is more obvious in the book than on television, the old age makeup does remarkably well.
I'm gonna say no. The old age makeup is brilliant, but his performance is subtly different. His body language is more stooped. He's not moving as fast, and it's a very subtly different and well thought through performance. And again, I can't disagree with you at all, Jason, because this is the hill I will die on. Is that everyone says Tom Baker can't be asked through this season. He is not go. He's not on the page. He's not giving his all, and that is completely wrong. He is giving this show everything right to the last minute. It's just the performance is not the wide freewheeling Graham Williams era Doctor that people had got used to. It's not the Philip Hinchcliffe era Dark Doctor. It's another layer of, and it. Again, it's not really until Legopolis or the start of Full Circle as well, where you get the very melancholy, sad Fourth Doctor. Here, you get every aspect of the Fourth Doctor in remixed and replayed, but he's still finding new ways of doing it. And I don't think you get a performance, and it's never lauded, and it should be, the performance of his anger at the Deciders in Full Circle, for instance, is a layer that we haven't seen in the Fourth Doctor for a very long time at that point, and it's superb, and he is biting back at every line of them. And there's lots of it here in this. People say he looks tired and old, and he doesn't look tired and old in the Leisure Hive at all. He looks exactly like he does in Sharda, and he looks gorgeous in the new costume because it fits him properly, because he's not ill and he's not gaunt yet and he hasn't lost the weight. He's filling this costume out, and he looks magnificent here, and it's one of his best performances.
I am sitting here vigorously nodding my head. Rarely a week goes by when I do not mentally replay that bit from part 3 of Full Circle between him and James Bree. And, of course, honorable mention to Alan Rowe and George Baker. They're all phenomenal in that scene. But Tom Baker shouting, "Not an alibi, Deciders," is one of my favorite line readings of the whole of his era. This is Tom Baker is 40, 41 when he starts, 48 or so when he finishes. He ages into the role, and I'm a little over 48 myself, so I sympathize looking in the mirror.
He's exactly my age at this point, so at 47. So,
and he was going through his thyroid disorder or whatever the illness was, lost a lot of weight, was losing his hair was going straight, so he looks physically ill in the E-Space stories. You're right, it hasn't quite happened yet, because this is the first recording of the season. But yeah, I'm just vigorously nodding my head. Anyone who says that Tom Baker is phoning it in has not watched season 18.
Not at all.
Another one of my favorite line readings, and I'm going to be stepping on my Full Circle guest's toes in a couple of weeks, but I want to bring it up now. When he's auditioning all of the Outlers as future companions at the end of Full Circle, and he's offering a short course in cytogenetics, that's another great line reading.
Mm-hmm.
He has no business reading that line as well as he does.
No, because people forget that Tom Baker is actually a really good actor when people make him work. And I think I'm a great lover of the Graham Williams era, and I think he gives some very interesting performances in that time that people don't necessarily watch what he's doing a lot of the time and are only picking on the worst aspects and the more over the top bits. But I think in season 18, he is generally faultless. He's really on what he's doing because his toes are being trodden on. So he's having to do what he's told, and he is responding in kind, and it works.
Absolutely. Now, we are almost 45 minutes into the recording. We've got to talk about the book for about 10 minutes. Again, I'm going to be... I've written, and I haven't recorded yet, my audio essay for the other half of the show after the break. This is one of my longer ones. This is a really interesting book with a lot of interesting deviations from the story because famously, the TV version of the story is not the story that David Fisher wanted to tell. He was telling sort of a black comedy about the mafia in outer space terms. I don't know how much of the Tachyon stuff is him versus Bidme. There's a lot more of it in the novelization than I was expecting. He goes heavily into the science in the book. But this wasn't the way that David Fisher wanted the story to turn out, and it winds up being his final work for Doctor Who in the 20th century. Then, of course, he comes back to write 2 old novelizations in the 21st. What is remarkable about this book for you, and did you volunteer for the book because of the book, or because of the TV, or for both?
Well, I was volunteered for this one because you volunteered me to do this one, knowing that I love it. So,
that's right.
But I'm very pleased to do this one because I think it is one of the gems of the Target book range. And again, one that doesn't always get singled out for as much love as it deserves because David Fisher has really gone to town on this one. One of my favourite things in this book is the chapter about the history of Argolis, which is very Douglas Adamsy. But what I love about this is that this takes what is done in a single line on TV where Vargos is saying dangerous because the atmosphere out there is deadly. And then this is expanded into a whole chapter of how Argolis became a deadly irradiated planet at great length. And it is wonderful. It's just world expanding. And you get those hints through the story about the 20-minute war and the Argolian love of war and the Famazi being a sort of similar sort of mirror race, only reptilian rather than, as they are on TV, sort of plant-based with the seeds falling out. But just this kind of expansion of the idea is absolutely beautiful. And David Fisher writes very Douglas Adamsy all the way through this. So it's because David Fisher is a funny writer as well. And so it's really beautifully written, very funny to read. And I've had the pleasure of Lalla Ward reading this on the audiobook version to me this week.
I am envious.
And it is, and she is exactly the right person to do that because she gets the humour. This is obviously her humour. She's comfortable with it, and she reads it beautifully. So that's one of the bits of the novel I really liked. I also very much liked sort of the expansion of the beach scenes with the candy floss seller and the other beach stall holder on a very wet and cold day in the UK, which I can perfectly understand because I went on beach holidays just like that, where we were going to the beach whatever the weather was doing because that's what we're doing on our holiday.
What's funny is there's also a Brighton Beach in Brooklyn.
Oh, right. Okay.
And it's right down the spit of land that is also Coney Island, which is where my grandmother lived through the 70s and 80s. I would sit at the window of her housing project. She was on the 13th floor. And I would look out at the Wonder Wheel, the famous Coney Island Ferris wheel going round and round. Brighton Beach is just a walk down the boardwalk. So I've spent a lot of time at Brighton Beach. So when I picture Brighton Beach, I'm picturing the Brooklyn one. I'm a Brooklyn born, I'm a Brooklyn resident. That's me. Now, the Brighton Beach in the UK, I believe it's a shingle beach rather than sand. It is,
yes. Lots of pebbles, yes. Mm-hmm.
And in June, as the book points out, it's almost wintry.
Yes, well, it can be, for sure. I've had days like that in June. And I'm just marvel at what David Fisher did with this story. I don't know whether this is more close to what he'd imagined the script was going to be originally. So there's much more played up of the mafia links within the Fomazi and the very cheeky FBI joke mirroring the CIA joke in The Deadly Assassin and things like
Yes.
that. So he's obviously really enjoying sort of writing about those things, which obviously he would have been a lot bigger part of his original story. But there's also, as you'll probably point out in your essay, so I won't dwell on this too much, but there's also quite a lot of scenes rewritten and reformatted so that they work better in prose than they did on TV. But some of that, I think, is to the detriment of Romana, particularly, who doesn't come across quite as strongly in the book as she does on TV.
I will mention this quite a bit in the upcoming audio essay. David Fisher tells his story through dialogue. Bickford tells his story through cuts and editing.
Yes.
So a lot of transitional scenes are removed and a lot of transitional dialogue is removed because Bickford is using the vision mixer to tell the story. And it's a great way of telling a story. That's what you can do with the visual image. You can get rid of a lot of the words. However, I do want to point out the Part 3 climax, where Romana is trapped in the generator, and Pangol is about to age her 2,000 years. Off screen, she is rescued from the generator by the FBI, the good Fomazi.
Yes.
Now, we don't see the rescue happen. We see Pangol throw the switch, and then we see Romana enter Hardin's lab, accompanied by the Fomazi. If you read the dialogue that she gets, she is the narrator of that scene in the book. End of chapter 7, whereas on television, Tom Baker gets all the dialogue.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How do I know that I can trust them, says Hardin. On TV, the doctor answers, but in the book, Romana answers. So I think, actually, that's one moment where the book gives Romana
a bit more.
Exactly, even though it's an outlier, but it is a much better moment for her in the book that is sadly not on television.
Yeah.
Another detail, and this is not coming up in the audio essay, so I'm not duplicating myself. An interesting detail is he goes more into Argolan society. Every surviving Argolan was a crew member on Morix's warship.
Yes.
That's why they survive.
And that's beautifully written. That's a really great twist that would have actually been great to see on TV, because you would understand why they don't want to go back to being a warlike race, why they're trying to forget that part of their past. You get little hints of it from Morix, but you don't get the full story. And I do wonder whether, was this in David Fisher's head while he was writing it? Had he sort of worked all these details out, or was he coming back to this and extrapolating from a line of dialogue into something bigger and thinking, oh, hang on, if I've said that, then this means that, oh, and I could do this and this.
Lawrence Payne does a great job, but he's only in 3 or 4 scenes as Morix, and he doesn't survive part 1. And I want to talk about the other actors in a moment. I think Lawrence Payne is great here in a small part. There's another great detail in chapter 7. Verdrix is the only Argolan who understood tachyonics, invented the science, made all the key discoveries, built the generator, and he was tragically the first Argolan to die of old age in 20 minutes. So that's a great detail. They have this incredible machine, but they can't use it because the only person who understood it was the first one to die of their terminal illness, which is why they had to outsource to planet Earth. And by the way, Mina's affair with Hardin is a lot more explicit in the book.
It certainly is. Yeah, not explicit, but it is
more obvious, I should say.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
So yeah, I just think it is all that detail, I think, that makes this something really special.
Before we go to our game of the week, let's talk about the greatest guest performances in the story, which do not get enough credit. Who do you think is the best, not counting Tom and Lalla, because they're both on fire? Who do you think gives the best performance in the story on the guest cast?
Oh, it's really difficult to choose because they're all great in different ways. One thing that, sort of thinking about it from differences in the book to TV, I'm going to say Nigel Lambert as Hardin, who on the page in the book, Hardin doesn't come across very strongly at all, but I think Nigel Lambert adds lots of interesting line readings and lots of interesting performance on screen, which brings the character alive. So his, as I've sort of mentioned, the obvious love that he has for Mina that keeps coming through, and that's really beautifully played by Nigel Lambert and it's sort of quite a touching thing. And I don't want to say that he's better than everyone else because I really admire lots of other performances, but I think just looking at it from the book point of view to TV, I think Nigel Lambert has added a lot to the character of Hardin.
That's interesting. I agree with everything you said, but he's not even in my top 3.
No, well, there we go, you see.
Okay, number 3. The character of Clout, who is the non-speaking aide, played by Ian Talbot, who does not have his own Wikipedia page, so I don't imagine he had a super long career. It's in the book, he's sort of a side character, and you only notice him by his absence. On television, Bickford knows that he is the assassin, and they make it very clear from visual looks and darting of his eyes and close-ups that he is bad news. So it's a great non-verbal performance.
Mm-hmm.
He does everything right in terms of looks to the camera and darting his head. Second, David Haig. He is 24 years old when this is being filmed. When I was 24 years old, I was barely capable of delivering a sentence to a member of the opposite sex. This guy at age 24, he's playing 3 characters in the story. He is playing the genial tour guide with a sarcastic edge. He is playing the cold-blooded boardroom warrior, which is I'm very familiar with from my day job. Number 3, he's playing Hitler.
Yes.
And he's doing all this in the same story, but you never doubt that it's the same actor playing the same character because he is so good at switching from one to the other. And he's only 24 years old, and here we are 40 years later. He is still performing regularly.
He's a great performer right from the very start of his career. And this is, it's a faultless performance. It's absolutely brilliant. I always really like the conspiratorial moments between him and Brock. Sort of again in part 3, where they're sort of discussing what happens if Mina dies and things like that, and it's beautifully framed by Lubbock Bickford. But it's really the dialogue between the 2 actors is sizzling. They're playing off each other beautifully.
Yes. And David Haig was in the movie Florence Foster Jenkins, playing Meryl Streep's vocal coach, with scenes opposite both her and Hugh Grant. So this is a guy who went from TC1, filming an entire story in 6 days, to being in a major motion picture with 2 huge stars. So this is a guy who's done everything, but his performance as Pango at age 24 tells you that this is a guy to watch out for, and he will certainly go on to great things. But the best performance in this story, who am I going to say?
It's got to be Adrian Corey, because
you might well think that. And you'd be absolutely correct, because she is phenomenal.
She is absolutely beautiful and brilliant. What I always remember on the Tom Baker Years video with Tom Baker, where he'd watched a clip from this story, and he always says, "There's Adrian Corey there, not giving not quite her all." And she's holding something back in the performance, and it's not over the top. It is beautifully understated and regal, and she is absolutely magnificent.
And she is playing, again, like Pangal, she's playing 3 different characters. In the beginning, she is the cold-blooded boardroom warrior. Mm-hmm. I'll play the audio clip on the other side of the break, which is coming up in a few minutes. But Bickford streamlines her intro scene, which David Fisher writes differently in the book. He does it as one walk and talk. She's storming down the hall and walks through the camera.
Yep, and back out the other side.
Right. And then she starts to age in part 2, and the performance that she gives as she's aging is wonderfully sensitive. And then, in the last scene, she is restored to her youth, and she's back in charge. And I love the line, "This time I must make sure to raise him properly."
Yes.
Baby Pangol. Another great line. So I don't understand how anybody can say this story is a triumph of style over substance.
No, because there's a whole lot of substance there. You've just got to look a little bit deeper.
Speaking of trial, there was a time when you were the all-time 20 questions record holder on this show.
I was for ages.
Our dear friend and our dear Trap One co-host, Conrad, who was one of our favorite people, he took your crown and he doesn't plan on giving it back. But fair is fair. I'm going to give you a chance to become a 2-time titleist.
Right, okay.
I have selected at random from the archives. And this is from the randomizer.net, a production of Flight Through Entirety, which is another one of many Doctor Who podcasts that you've been on that I don't have time to listen to. I have selected one story between 1963 and 2022. You are going to guess the serial through 20 questions, yes or no. Which story am I? Question number 1.
Okay, I'm going to do a Mark McManus, and I'm just going to go for one story at random, and then I will start just on the off chance that I get it. And I am going to say, are you The Invasion of Time?
Ooh, that's very interesting. Had you been correct, you would have been the all-time titleist, and nobody would ever have been able to take away your crown. But sadly, as much as I love the story and the book, I am not The Invasion of Time.
Okay.
Question 2.
Am I a 20th century story?
I am not a 20th century story, even
okay.
though I myself am a 20th century boy. Question 3.
Mm-hmm. Are you Russell T. Davies production?
I am not
Okay.
a Russell T. Davies
Oh!
production. That brings us to question 4. So far, you're 0 for 3. Question 4.
Okay. Am I Chris Chibnall?
No, I am not Chris Chibnall.
Okay.
Question 5. This may be the record for most incorrect questions to start off.
I am not doing well here.
You're doing better than the AI did last week, I can tell you that much.
Am I a
Question
Matt
5.
Smith story?
I am a Matt Smith story. Question 6.
Okay. Am I a Matt Smith with Clara story?
No, I am not a Clara story. Question 7.
Question 7. Am I a story written by Stephen Moffat?
No, I am not a story written by Stephen Moffat, I should say. Question 8. This is at the time when you were the record holder. I think it was 8. So this was your old
It was,
title.
yeah. So, okay. Let me think. What have we got? Am I a Chris Chibnall story?
You mean written by Chris Chibnall
Yes.
for Stephen Moffat? That's a really good question. That's your second Chris Chibnall question out of the 8, but no, I am not a written by Chris Chibnall script.
Right, okay.
Question 9.
Am I a two-parter?
No, I am not a 2-parter. Question 10. You're at the halfway mark, and you've had more no's than yeses.
Am I from season 6?
No, I am not season 6. I think that puts us at question 11 now.
Yep, okay. Let me think. This is a very tricky one to sort of narrow down. Okay, I'm just going to...
I'm going to tell you guys, audience, sports fans, this is a very unusual performance. This is Simon on the back foot. Simon usually has an answer for everything.
And today, I'm not.
This is why he has been on every Doctor Who podcast ever, and I have not. But right now, I have the upper hand. Simon is on the ropes.
Yeah,
It's the 13th round. He's behind on all the scorecards. Jerry Cooney is coming for him. Question 11 or question 12? I forget where we are.
Am I by Toby Whithouse?
No, I am not by Toby Whithouse.
Okay. Right. Is the story written by someone who's only written one Doctor Who adventure?
That is a very smart question, and yes, it is a story written by somebody who only wrote one Doctor Who adventure.
Okay.
Now,
So
you probably are going to get it on the very next question. I think there's a couple of different people who hold that title, but I'm positive you're going to get it right now. Question 13, we'll say.
Is it Vincent and the Doctor?
Yes, I am Vincent and the Doctor.
Hooray!
One of my absolute favorite from
It's
the
a
Matt
gorgeous
Smith era.
story.
One of my absolute favorite from the Stephen Moffat, Matt Smith era. And it's one of the few, it may be the only Doctor Who that my mother has watched by herself, not over my shoulder, because it's about, as we say here in the States, Vincent van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were memes and GIFs from this story all over Facebook for years and years and years. And that last 2-minute clip with Bill Nye in the museum talking about Vincent while Vincent is standing right there, that's always making the rounds on social media as one of the greatest scenes ever written and one of the greatest performances ever given, Tony Curran. My mother watched the whole thing on her own because she's a big Vincent van Gogh fan. Former art student my mother was. And she calls me and she says, "Why did there have to be a monster in it?"
Well, it's a good point. It's just a beautiful piece of Doctor Who and faultless. It's a gorgeous story.
And I don't have the sales numbers, but I would envision that the mock-up of Starry Night with the TARDIS flying through the sky is probably one of the most owned pieces of Doctor Who merchandise coming out of the new series.
I would have thought so. Yeah, that was beautifully done as well.
I am now going to reload the randomizer because next week we have another story.
Mm-hmm.
Next week we have another guest. And let's see what we will see. Oh, my goodness. There is a good chance that my guest next week is going to get this in one.
Oh, my goodness.
Anything else would be a spoiler because my guest from next week may actually hear this before I record the next episode. So
yeah, don't give it away.
I may have to change the recording schedule. So, Si, we've already talked about where else we can find you, but anything else coming up that you want to plug?
No, I'm just listen out for some interesting episodes of Trap One coming up. So we're going to be looking at the anniversaries of Doctor Who so far during the year, and I think those are going to be great fun to do. So I'm looking forward to hosting all of those.
And I am going to be on at least 2 of those that I've already signed up for. So I'm very much looking forward to recording those with you.
Brilliant.
All right, Si, thank you so much. Have a great night.
It's a pleasure, as always. Thank you, Jason.
Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive by David Fisher. Televised as The Leisure Hive. Teleplay by David Fisher. Televised in August and September 1980. Published in July 1982. Cover artist, Andrew Skilleter. The Leisure Hive on the planet Argolis is an entertainment center for galactic travelers. At the heart of the hive is the Tachyon Recreation Generator, a machine with a most extraordinary performance capability and vital to the continued existence of the Argolan after their devastating war with the reptilian Fomasi. While visiting the hive, the Doctor and Romana are sucked into a whirlpool of treachery and deceit and are eventually arrested on suspicion of murder. So Si and I have already cavilled about the TV serial at great length. I don't need to repeat most of that, except to say that Love at Bickford takes a 2-minute opening pan of Brighton, which should in theory be the most boring visual, since it took Carol Ann Ford and Jacqueline Hill 7 minutes to walk down a corridor in the Sensorites. 7 minutes. Remembering that Lime Grove D, where the Sensorites was taped, was so small that Dr. Roger Bannister could have run the 4-minute mile in 20 seconds if he were in Lime Grove D. Yes, that analogy makes no sense, I know, don't at me, but the point is it takes a specific set of acting skills to take 7 minutes to walk across that studio. But Bickford makes that 90-second opening pan a soaring triumph of the human soul. There's Peter Howell's score, which does to Dudley Simpson what the original Star Wars did to previous science fiction films. There's the dubbing in, of Tom Baker snoring, the surprise appearance of the TARDIS placed amidst a row of beach huts, and then as Romana is giving the Doctor a history of the Argolan War, a pan backwards through space, as the Brighton image shrinks into a ball, and we fly through the new opening credit starfield and onto Argolis, with the Leisure Hive of the title represented by one of the best tabletop model cities that Classic Who would ever produce. Bickford shoots scenes from novel angles. He zooms in from outside to inside the hive during a Harden and Mina scene. He films a reaction shot of Romana from inside the generator to set up the Part 2 cliffhanger. And there's a nice handheld camera angle from the studio floor of Pangal conspiring with another Argolan over the generator console late in Part 3. What could have been a dull Part 2 exposition scene where Mina explains the state of Argolis after the war to the Doctor and Romana, Bickford also shoots from odd angles and in odd colors to keep your mind from wandering. Bickford's direction is so eye-catching that it masks the fact most of the story recycles heavily from David Fisher's past work. From Fisher's own Stones of Blood, the Doctor is once again put on trial by an overly stringent legal system. From Fisher's own Creature from the Pit, you get the Part 3 cliffhanger featuring a villain rather than a hero in jeopardy, and the decoy defeat of that villain early in Part 4 before another big bad emerges. From Fisher's own, kinda sorta, City of Death, you get the experiments with time through nozzle-shaped projectors and characters being aged near to death. Check out the paragraph from page 67 of this book about Harden's time flow experiments. Quote, once, he had even succeeded in reversing the flow of time, so that a chicken had been regressed into an egg. But on each and every occasion, something had gone wrong. Sounds familiar, right? While the visual look of this story evolves Doctor Who, the same way that Superman the movie evolved superhero movies, it's curious that David Fisher never wrote another Doctor Who TV script after this one. And it's easy to point to the televised version of Leisure Hive to explain why he didn't come back. What Fisher submitted would have been a broad Season 17-style satire on British tourism, with the name of the reptilian bad guys, the Fomassi, being an acronym of the word mafioso. You can imagine David Fisher at home, a holdover from the previous regime, scratching his head at Bickford's remaking of the story, and shouting at the TV, "What happened to my reptile mobsters?" The first 20% of the novelization of the Leisure Hive is filled with seemingly irrelevant tangents that didn't make it close to air. The opening chapter retells the Brighton Beach prologue from the point of view of two concessionaires. There's a baffling aside about Japanese tourists. Maybe that was what passed for a joke in the 70s or early 80s. Tourists aren't inherently funny just because they come from a particular country. Now, Fisher could be making a point about the xenophobia of English vendors, in contrast or setting up what we later see on Argolis, but you have to squint really hard to make that analogy. For every good observation in the chapter, 20th century Earth history is considered too violent for the historical reenactors of Xene 4. There's an unfortunate remark like the Doctor being in no hurry to fix a waterlogged K9. I'll fix him sometime, the Doctor yawns on page 8. Chapter 2 is a largely tongue-in-cheek history of the Argolan people, which seems to be aiming at Douglas Adams-style humor. A similar vein can be found in Fisher's 21st century Who novelizations, or in just about every other book put out under the revived Target banner. Here we get numerous anecdotes about the violent past of Argolis. If you can stomach the saga of Harold the Hapless and Mako the Mighty, you'll learn more about severed legs than in most other books marketed to children. The following line on page 14 seems specifically designed to tickle my unfunny bone. The only rules were those of the jungle. Kill or be killed. Eat or wind up as the shish kebab. Later on, we learn about Professor Igor Shabunkin of the University of New Caledonia and someone named Hyperion C. Blackadder, quote, an Irish missile research engineer working on Tethys. Holy mackerel, that's a long way to go for a single paragraph joke that doesn't recur over the rest of the book. A couple of journalists take over most of Part 3, set on Earth. This has observational humor value, but it's not related to the story. Not to say this stuff isn't interesting, it is. Two journalists assigned to Earth, which at this point is a barren outpost free of celebrities. Intergalactic war has whittled Earth's population down to two occupations, accountants and tea dispensing machine engineers to serve all those tea drinking accountants and their tea dispensing machines. One journalist is so good at his job, the other is not, though they both wind up missing the big story about the TV characters that we'll come to know as Mina and Hardin. But if the original script submitted by Fisher contains similarly vain humor, it's easy to see why Bidmead and Bickford so heavily altered them. Pangol's introduction, in this same chapter, is one of the few scenes in the first quarter of the book that has a TV counterpart, and actually goes on for longer, though a long digression about how the Chromads discovered tachyonics I found more exhausting than amusing. Chapter 4 is interesting. This is where the book largely stops trying to be outrageously funny and just tells a really good story. The dialogue on TV can be found in Chapter 4, but often reallocated. On TV, Pangol is represented as Morix's son, not in the book. The Doctor and Romana's TV conversation about the tachyon having been discovered on Earth is reassigned in the book to an obnoxious Earth tourist, referred to as a Terran nationalist. Dialogue from Brock in the book about how the Fomassi are now the only race that can inhabit Argolis belongs to Morix on TV. Pangol's lovely line in Part 1, as Si and I discussed, the worst guided tour speech in history.
For the next hour and a half, we will examine the wave equations that define the creation of solid tachyonic images.
Is heavily altered and is reassigned to a conversation, well, a verbal duel between the Doctor and Pangol, which presages the ending of the story at least. There are two great back-to-back paragraphs on page 38. Pangol once again blandly agreed with the woman, but Romana, who was watching him, could see the rage boiling inside the young Argolan. It was like a forest fire. One day, it would get out of control. How you hate all these visitors to your planet, she thought. Excuse me, said the Doctor. May I ask a question? The lady in the fluorescent suit attempted to wither the tall, oddly dressed figure with a glance. In the course of her 7 marriages, it was a technique she had employed successfully to reduce her husbands to nervous wrecks. But the Doctor, unwithered, unwrecked, smiled amiably. Now, so far, and this is page 38, Fisher had been spending a lot of time clearing his throat. This is a good page because it mixes the actual plot and it foreshadows Pangol's villainy with some of the more wacky observational humor. That works better for me than just pages that have nothing but wacky observational humor. The book also contains a factually accurate reference to Cherenkov radiation. Hope I pronounced that right. There are no footnotes, like in the Creature from the Pit book, but there are parenthetical asides. Page 41. It was the duty of the maintenance guides to monitor all functions of the Leisure Hive 20.5 hours a day. Incidentally, 20.5 hours was the length of the Argolan day. Mina's arrival in the book on pages 44 through 46 is good, but under Lovett Bickford's direction, it's even grander on TV. Adrian Corey sweeping down the hall and speaking imperiously.
Earth shuttle arriving. Attention. Earth shuttle arriving.
My dear Mina, I must say how sorry I am about Morix. He was a fine Argolin.
He did his duty. I automatically become chairman in his place.
We expected you to bring the Earth scientist with you.
Hardin and his assistant will be here by the next shuttle. Meanwhile, I have a hollow crystal of the first trials.
Pangol will want to see this.
Leave him to his work.
Your son has no great love for this Earth scientist, has
He resents the fact that Hardin has found a better use for tachyonics than these Argolin games.
A better use?
Yes, Brock, a better use. Hardin has learned to manipulate time.
All of Part 2 is compressed into a single chapter, Chapter 6, titled Hardin, encompassing 24 pages. Lots of differences from the TV, mainly reassigned lines of dialogue or reimagined conversations. The dialogue in the book is sharper. The TV was more concerned with visual transitions and telling the story by edits and camera angles and Peter Howell's score, whereas the book, of course, could only rely upon its words. The idea of Mina and Hardin having had an affair on Earth is more obvious in the book, as Mina thinks, quote, anything to distance herself from those few mad days she had spent on Terra with this man. In the book, Mina tells the Doctor why she's invested so heavily in tachyon research, and the Doctor responds, "Why is it I don't believe you?" This is an important lead-in to what we learn in Part 4, but the TV version doesn't have such an exchange. In the book, Mina is charmed by the Doctor's bluntness and tells him the truth. On TV, this is done in a wonderfully underrated scene in which Mina volunteers the information on her own.
Beautiful. Yes. Radon 222 decays rapidly.
But not the heavy metal dust. It won't be habitable for 3 centuries.
Yeah? Why? How long did the war last?
20 minutes.
How long was that?
Now you understand the purpose of the hive.
To keep out the atmosphere.
The physical reason, yes. But the purpose is to promote understanding between life forms of all culture and genetic type. There must be no more such wars.
So it's not just a recreation center.
Even the games in our experiential grid explore alien environments. Each race learns to understand what it is like to be the foreigner.
Like learning the language.
Language and thought. Let me show you the grid. Not again, this is intolerable.
What happened?
Interfibril malfunction. A line's gone down. So many faults. Accidents. The death this morning.
Do you think the hive's been interfered with?
The fibre optic transmission system has a mean time between failure of 2,000 years.
What do they do with that in the TARDIS?
It's far in excess of our own needs.
Future generations will appreciate it.
The few of us who survived the war have our own price to pay. There will be no future generations.
The transmission fault has...
Romana in the book, as in City of Death, is instrumental in finishing a hapless Earth professor's time flow experiments. Here, unlike in City, Hardin survives, but page 70 has a great exchange not on TV, continuing on from the scene where Hardin confesses that his machine doesn't work. "Oh, I know that," said Romana calmly. "But what I don't understand is why it doesn't. You see, I think it ought to work." The book also contains more detail on Hardin and Stimson, making the former more sympathetic, and even making the latter, a one-episode-only bit of cannon fodder, slightly sympathetic in his death throes. The Doctor's discovery that his own scarf has been used to strangle one of the hive guests is staged much better on TV than as presented in the book. Thank you again, Mr. Bickford, for having one of the actual murderers, Brock, be the one who implicates the Doctor as the true suspect. And while the "arrest the scarf" line is the same in both the book and on TV, there's no fair fight between hearing Tom Baker say the line versus one of us trying to say it in our own heads. Arrest the scarf, then. Yeah, there's no comparison with Tom Baker. The Doctor's trial on TV is told visually. Hardin says his now working rejuvenator device needs a test. Pangol, who just suggested that the Doctor undergo trial by ordeal, repeats, "a test," and then we cut to the test. A clever transition, which tells the story by cutting and not by dialogue. You could do that in the book, but Fisher transitions with words and dialogue instead. Now I do like this bit, page 79. Pangol laughed, mirthlessly. "You want to test a living organism," he said. "So do we." He indicated the Doctor. "What about him?" "Trial by ordeal. It's the ancient Argolan way." "You must have lost a lot of litigants over the years," observed the Doctor. "At least we don't need any court of appeal on Argolis." That's good dialogue. It would have worked fine on TV, and I love any Doctor Who story that contains the word litigants, but it works just as well the way that Bickford does the transition. Again, the visual versus the printed page. On TV, Pangol gets an extra line just before the cliffhanger, not in the book, dismissing Hardin's experiments as, quote, "a few years' gain for an individual, perhaps." That line foreshadows what Pangol really wants to do with the generator. Not in the book. Part 3 is also compressed into a single chapter, the 20-page Chapter 7. The Doctor's aging is explored in more detail. On TV, stop me If you've heard me say this already before this show, the visuals do the work. The Doctor's effective old age makeup and Tom Baker's acting choices making this an interesting diversion. As a kid, I was disappointed that the parts 3 and 4 opening titles weren't altered to include the Doctor's old man look. In the book, Fisher explores the ramifications of what this aging means. So this is what it's like being old. Everyone thinks you're a candidate for the funny farm just because you have a few white hairs, and are a bit forgetful now and again. Page 87. In another sharp bit of writing, Romana reflects that the old Doctor has, quote, the face of a tired old man who barely knew where he was. Romana also has a moment of introspection when she suspects that she, too, will be aged near to death by the tachyon chamber. Chapter 7 also has a different structure from TV's Part 3. It loses some good TV lines, the Doctor reflecting he felt as if he'd been in the generator for centuries, but also adds good lines not on TV. Mina unable to classify the verdict of the aged Doctor's trial by combat. We're missing a really good TV scene between Mina and Hardin, which sets up the mystery of Pangol and the Part 4 climax involving Pangol trying to recreate himself in the generator, and then sets up their next scene when Pangol reveals to Mina that Hardin faked his experiments. Also on TV, the Doctor's line about the recreation generator being recreation generator is taken at face value. In the book, it's mistaken for senile ramblings. My main point here, most of Part 3 is very different from your stereotypical Part 3 of 4 pad and capture, escape, capture loops. On TV, Part 3 is the Doctor sciencing up the plot, looking to solve two mysteries. One, how to reverse his aging, and two, who is Pangol? And Part 3 is also a series of debates between Brock and Pangol, the money-minded accountant trying to rescue the Hive from bankruptcy, and Pangol, the young patriot, who wants to rescue the Hive in his own way. What enlivens these debates? The fact that both Brock and Pangol have secrets to hide, and that they both get unmasked at the end of Part 3, one of them quite literally. This story is nearly unique for Classic Who, in that it has two different hidden villains, both revealed late in the story, and I didn't mention him with Si, alongside Adrian Corey, and David Haig, and Nigel Lambert, but I gotta shout out to John Collins' oily, contract-wrangling accountant Brock, another actor who doesn't often make a list of great human villains on Classic Who, but he's gotta be at least in the discussion. The Brock-Pangol double twist is memorable plotting. The TV version also intercuts all those scenes. The Doctor on the one hand, Brock and Pangol on the other, each scene ending with a slight tease or mystery on which the next scene in alternating locations builds. The book has these scenes, but in a slightly different order, and with much less intercutting. Think of the TV as the Marshall Lucas final cut of the 1977 Star Wars, and the book as the original George Lucas workprint. All the material was there, but needed judicious editing and deleting many scenes in order to become perfection. Some of the deleted material, the deleted scenes in the book are interesting and are definitely worth exploring, such as the detour into the finances of the Hive, how the Argolan can't afford to maintain it. I also like the parts of the book that explains the beauty of the heavy metal-soaked Argolan night sky. Page 90. Night on Argolis was perhaps even more spectacular than the day. At night, the jewels of Argolis, as some long-forgotten poet had christened them, the 7 Argolan moons, reflected light from the suns. The rainbow-hued atmosphere of the planet, the ever-changing kaleidoscope of colors, was transmuted into tones of blue and silver and gray, as the moonlight was reflected by the dust clouds. Argolis, thought Romana, was one of the most beautiful planets she had ever seen, particularly if you saw it from behind glass. Oh, and on page 97, the Doctor literally forgets who Romana is. Wow, that's dark. Chapter 8, The Fomassi, gets to the heart of Fisher's Mafia parody. A parody set in a high-tech resort on another planet at the end of a 20-minute war that nearly wiped out 2 species. We learn that, same way most of the Argolan survivors served on Morix's flagship, most of the Fomassi survivors were either underground prisoners or their correction officers, known respectively as White and Black Fomassi. Page 105. All the great Fomassi criminal clans, or families as they were called, were represented amongst the survivors. In the past, the clans had always devoted much of their time trying to eliminate their rivals. Their surviving brethren therefore continued the tradition. Ancient vendettas were pursued, old scores were settled, clan fought clan, even more savagely than before. In time, the clans themselves fragmented. They split up into smaller and smaller units. Some years ago, the Fomassi Bureau of Investigation had been formed, with the object of breaking the power of the surviving clans, of which only two remained, the Twin Sons and the West Lodge. Now this is not exactly subtle. The Fomassi Bureau of Investigation, think Elliot Ness showing up in Part 4, but speaking with Al Capone's voice synthesizer. This is either clever satire or a sledgehammer against the point. It's a long scene of the book, and it accurately describes mafia bust-out tactics, as seen in that Sopranos episode with Robert Patrick, which, by the way, one of the best of that series, Season 2, featuring roles for Paul Mazursky and Frank Sinatra Jr., whom Paulie Walnuts calls the chairboy of the board. Very little of David Fisher's backstory is preserved in the TV production of Leisure Hive. Only scant fractions of the Fomassi special agent's words and thoughts make it on camera. Fisher also explains in the book why the rest of the Argolans fall so quickly into line behind Pangol when he deposes the dying Mina. It's a good lesson in fascism, and very apt to this world of 2023 to be sure. Chapter 9. Mostly terrific. Breathless prose, largely faithful to what we saw on television. The Doctor's a little more senile in the book, like we said, and he breaks the randomizer by accident. Fisher writes good prose. Page 115, he, the Doctor, looked so old that she, Romana, felt he would crumble to dust if she touched him. That's the kind of writing I wish was all the way through the book, instead of being focused on the last two-thirds. Now, Fisher also makes two mistakes in Chapter 9 that were not caught in the edit. One, he forgets to say that the Doctor is restored to his youth by the generator. Second, after the randomizer breaks, page 117, fell to the floor and shattered into a dozen pieces, end quote. By page 126, the Doctor and Romana act like the randomizer is still intact and could easily be retrieved from the generator and put back in the TARDIS. The TV version is much more clear here, except Bidmead makes a mistake too, having Romana talk about a FIFO stack, a computer programming term, when what she should have said was a FIFO queue. Bidmead, who almost certainly wrote that line, would have known that it's a LIFO stack, last in, first out, or a FIFO queue, first in, first out. Now, open up your podcast app, hit the 15 seconds back button on this episode, listen to my discourse on FIFO queues and LIFO stacks again. There you go. There you have it. That will be the last negative thing I ever have to say about Christopher H. Bidmead on this show, and we still have all three of his books in front of us.
As long as we can conduct
In sum, this is a very interesting book. It's part of the movement really beginning in 1982, which we have not seen in several years, to separate the books out from their TV parents, to give us a closer look at the original scripts, to give us asides, a broader scope. This is still a very short book, about the length of any Terrence book of the time. It is only 123 or 124 pages of print. Tonally, the book is all over the place. Like I said, the first 3 chapters are heavy on satire that didn't quite land for me. The last 6 chapters get progressively more serious with some really good, strong writing. And there's a lot more science in the book than I recalled. I had assumed that Christopher H. Bidmead delivered most of the tachyonics, but if Fisher is writing to his original notion, there is an awful lot of interesting science in here. The book ends with a little bit of a rush, with the author forgetting to restore the Doctor to 750 years of age from 1250. You can imagine that every Tom Baker novelization after this one features the 1250-year-old Methuselah Beard Doctor. The middle chapters are golden. The beginning and the very end could use a little bit of work. But the target books are growing up, and the next several books after this one are going to continue the trend. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we jump ahead to Season 19. It is the first book of the Peter Davison era. It is the first book with a controversial photographic cover rather than an evocative painting. It is written by an author writing his first Doctor Who script, and by extension his first Doctor Who novelization. On the strength of the script, he is given the job of script editor, where he will stay for most of the next 5 years. He will leave behind a very complicated legacy that we are going to start to untangle, beginning next week and running over the next several years of this podcast. Well, both the next several years' worth of books that this podcast will cover, and probably most of the rest of the roughly 2 years that this podcast has to go in its release schedule. Next week, join me and the godfather of this show as we discuss the arrival of Season 19, the arrival of Peter Davison, and the arrival of one Eric Sayward. Next time. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Special thanks to my special guest, Si Hart of Maximum Power and many, many, many other podcasts. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and on email at DoctorWhoLiterature, that's DrWhoLiterature @gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.